Smeltings School was a vast concrete building network constructed on the site of the old Smeltings Boys' Grammar, which was built on the site of the very successful steel works. The original school had burned down, its building razed to the ground in the 1960s by departing students having an end-of-year lark. That had been the official canon, duly recorded in the prospectus at any rate, although it had long been suspected that it had been an insurance job carried out by the headmaster, and the extensive facilities added during the construction of the replacement school did nothing to dispel this rumor. These days the school was independent, and, as long as you were male and your parents could afford the tuition fees, the school would bend over backwards to accommodate you. As far as modern thinking was concerned, Smeltings strove as hard as it could be to be inclusive by isolating vast swathes of the local population. These were the thoughts that passed through the head of Philip McFarlane as he scanned the boys sitting before him in his English lesson, heads bent in supplication, or at least mock supplication. Many could feign work where necessary, one even citing it as a specialized skill upon his curriculum vitae. He had joined the school 2 years ago with the lure of a large pension and better working conditions, but the latter was in fact a fallacy. A larger wage and prospects were balanced unequally with numerous duties, those of his house, during prep and homework, meals and rest time. In addition, lessons extended to a Saturday, and though only until 1 o'clock, Saturday afternoons and Sundays were the realm of extracurricular activities to which each student was expected to contribute, and which Mr. McFarlane had deftly managed to avoid for most of the year. 3 weeks Easter break had been a marvelous incentive. Philip could not deny this, and that would have been a wonderful break had it not been filled with a week of Easter school, preparing Year 9 students for their forthcoming GCSE exams, and the Year 11s with their A-levels. In fact, mused Philip McFarlane grimly, with the maintenance he had to pay his ex-wife he had very little spare money. In fact, he would be better off working in a supermarket for what little he did have. Shattering his jaded thoughts, the raised hand of the lad near the back row brought McFarlane back to the here and now. "Yes, Michaels? Finished that already?" "Yes, sir. There should be some questions on the back, extending your understanding by dash." "Finished those too, Joseph Michaels?" a slightly built 15-year-old interrupted, following Philip's gaze to the filing cabinet of additional worksheets. "And those?" he added, unabashed. "What, all of them?" Philip asked, knowing what the answer was going to be. Michaels nodded as Mr. McFarlane sighed inwardly. That was another thing. For each of the lessons, lasting an hour and a half each, you were expected to fill with 1 hour and 29 minutes of material. The boys would file in, sit themselves down and lay out their equipment in silence, waiting for him to begin the lesson. Even with his problem-solving device of a well-stocked cabinet filled with every conceivable pedagogical worksheet suitable for every level and interest, Philip had to concede that on occasion the situation to being in a pit that was filling with water, despite his efforts in bailing out to keep his head above the water, more replaced it. "Swap with Spago and work together on marking each other's work," concluded McFarlane, holding out 2 mark schemes. "Check what you've got against these and write some recommendations for improvements for each other." Michaels and Spago exchanged glances as McFarlane held out the sheets of paper firmly. It had taken most of the year to instill these workaday state school practices in his own classroom, and the lads still were reluctant to use them. McFarlane's mind flicked back to his last school, a local comprehensive whose intake consisted of those which Smeltings could not, or would not, accommodate, a situation which caused not least a moderate level of mutual intolerance. He'd chosen his bed, so to speak, and as such had been out of the comprehensive system too long. The discipline alone now would probably be enough to kill him. Putting aside his thoughts as more and more of the lads came to the end of the work, Mr. McFarlane began a class discussion, the topic being an analysis of the 2 Shakespeare comedies that they were studying. Discussions were one practice that all of his classes had taken to relatively quickly, They had debating lessons and as such were always ready to practice within a different context, and it was something of which Philip was proud, that each lad could be included and progress could clearly be seen. Ofsted would indeed be impressed. 10 minutes later, as the debate drew to a close, satisfaction sat well with Philip McFarlane as he looked with teacherly pride around his classroom. Each student was integrating with his teaching strategy and gaining a great deal. Who said that he could not adapt his style to suit their learning needs? 100% suck dash. It wasn't completely successful. Not all of the lads had participated in the debate. In fact, the boy in question rarely participated in much. Vain comfort, McFarlane concluded, the new lad was not fitting in well round school as it was. He was aware of Darren Malloy's odd behavior, weird mannerisms and the clear lack of general knowledge about, well, anything. As the rest of the lads in his class busied themselves with a written discourse each based on the earlier debate, Malloy returned to staring out of the window. Leaving the boy be, Philip recalled his initial thoughts of the new Smeltings student. At first he believed Darren Malloy to be from abroad. He had found out his old notes about strategies for including students to whom English was a second language, and it had surprised him when the lad had spoken to him in a crystal cut upper crust accent. But there was something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The way the teenager looked at him, sometimes the way he would catch his eye. It was true that most of the lads here thought you were lower than them. As a fee-paying body they believed that you worked for them or for their parents. But with Malloy, there was something more. It was as if he was not only below him, but of a different species. As his head of house, Philip McFarlane knew enough that he should keep an eye on him. 88,888,888. The bright sunny midweek day had incited Cecilia into hand-washing the laundry in order to take advantage of the warmth and gentle breeze that was ideal drying weather. A basket of washing beside her with another soaking in the sink, Cecilia had located a large length of twine from the cellar, winding some out so that the outer, dusty twill and discarding it before stringing it between the handle of the outside kitchen door and a small hawthorn tree that stood 20 feet away. This gave her enough drop for the garments, towels and bedding to be off the floor but with enough surface area exposed. Yes, of course she could leave it for Remus, she often did. It would be nothing to him to transform a heap of washing into an ironed and folded pile. But there was a base satisfaction in doing this domestic task today. What could be more heavenly than to see sheets, hand-washed, she hastened to add, blowing in the breeze. It reminded her of a little, like the line of clothing in washing powder advertisements that enticed you into recreating the dream with a box of Ultra Dazzle or similar. The clothes line was no problem, Cecilia thought as she folded her first sheet over it, spreading it out carefully. It was all very well dreaming about clean washing blowing on a line. It was how she was to secure what she had put on it when she had no pegs. Well, perhaps she could leave the drying of the peg essentials to Remus when he returned, and risk the larger things blowing off. That could work, she concluded as she pulled out a second sheet. He'd been back to his usual self that morning, explaining that, despite everything, Dumbledore still required his skill for the order work he had been doing before his reprimand from the ministry. Cecilia's heart had soared when he told her this, not least because of the information that he had told her meant he trusted her, and wasn't pushing her away. It also meant she'd done the right thing in refusing to pursue her new theory, even if it had resulted in a disagreement with Snape. Bending down to the laundry basket as a mischievous zephyr whipped about, fluttering the hung sheets as if they were sails on an 18th-century tall ship. As she watched them quiver, a thought crossed her mind: she still had some money, more money. A walk to Ambleside on a wonderful day like this and back before she knew it, a good stretch of the legs. And she could get hold of a newspaper. Find out what was going on in the world. Cecilia pulled the last sheet over her makeshift line, collecting the basket of peg requiring laundry as she made her way back inside the cottage. Yes, a walk to Ambleside would be lovely. 5 minutes later Cecilia had made a list of other items of shopping which would also be useful, including another notebook and a visit to a chemist to buy paracetamol, shampoo, deodorant, pegs and so on. Batteries for the radio as it was on their last pair. As it was a Wednesday the local farmers market would be on and she could look through some things which might be on sale in Bloom's. And some gas canisters for the burner wouldn't go amiss. Drawing a full stop at the end of the word canister, Cecilia idly enlarged it as she pondered her last foray into the gas canister world. She hadn't mentioned anything to Remus about her flu powder find, nor about Callias, his murdered brother, and so consequentially she had not talked about her need for more fuel. What did he know of his older brother? Did he know at all? When the time was right, Cecilia thought, she would mention it. She would broach the subject soon and reveal her find. This week. Otherwise her concealment of her discovery would make her what she had worried Remus would become by keeping the truth from her. Cecilia made her way over to the sink, 3/4 full with used washing water which was now losing its heat to the surrounding air, and plunged in her hands, grasping the first article that she came to and twisting out the water firmly as the thought of her impending shopping trip. A sputter of green in the living room grate stopped Cecilia Frobisher in mid-ring. Had a photographer been at hand, sneaking in for a stolen shot of domesticity, he might well have been confused on catching his unwitting subject already frozen with the only betrayal that time was still in progress being the residual droplets of water yielding to gravity. What, or who, was attempting to contact her via flu? She didn't have to wait long. As Cecilia stared, watching the sporadic sparks spray from the center, and to her amazement the head of someone she least expected appeared ghoulish green in the grate. "Tunks!" she exclaimed, dropping the well-wrung washing back into the sink as she rushed into the living room, the water dripping down her still held-up arms. "What are you doing here?" There was a pause. As Cecilia waited for the witch to fill it, a disconcerting thought filled her mind: she doesn't want me. But her gloomy thoughts were repelled when Tunks grinned her characteristic grin. "Watcher. How are you, Sec?" Tunks began, her hair, even in the fiery flu light, managing to change hue. "Fine, absolutely fine," she replied truthfully as the image of her best friend fleeted over her cerebellum. "Yourself? What are you up to?" asked the witch. "Are you working? If you are, I could come over and help." "Actually," said Cecilia, feeling the washing water drizzle down her arms and pool in her armpits, "I was just about to go to town. I need some more fuel before I can do any more of that." "Great!" exclaimed Tunks. "Fancy some company? I'll be over in 2 shakes." They flew to the waterfall about half a mile back from the Salutation Hotel, which lay at the top of the main street of Ambleside. Tunks had somehow ascertained a safe appearance place using the portable flu network, however it was close. A trickle of tourists ran along the main path that allowed the full view of the trickle of water falling over the rocky outcrop high above them, and they had to dodge round the back of the hydro-potential attraction before incorporating themselves into the throng. The weather, though changeable in this part of England, was just as glorious as 10 miles away, and the pair of women made their way on foot towards the small lakeside town. As they walked they made polite conversation, the sort that ancient adversaries made when a feud had long since been settled. In a way, they had been adversaries, inadvertent rivals for the affection of a man. Now, that had been settled and both were happy. "Remus said he'd invited you and Nick," Cecilia began conversationally as they made their way down towards the town. "It was lovely seeing you last time." "He did," Tunks agreed, her hair glinting golden in the sunlight. "We'd be delighted to come, but we can't make it just yet. Cecilia, are you okay?" Tunks's voice changed from easy conversation to concerned alarm as Mrs. Frobisher came to an abrupt halt, holding her stomach. Waiting for the nausea to pass, Cecilia nodded as best as she could, but Tunks was having none of it, and she took her arm with one hand, holding her up. I'm all right, Tunks. Really? Cecilia managed, defending her original stance against the younger woman's doubtful look. It's been happening on and off for the last week or so, and I know what it is. What is it? Echoed Tunks, still looking at her with concern. Magic, Cecilia revealed, beginning her walk again. Because I've been out of a magical environment for so long. It's like, when I was at Hogwarts I built up a tolerance, but now because I'm out of it, I'm affected by small amounts. Wow, said Tunks, who continued to walk too. Yeah? I mean, I've heard about something similar. Dad suffers from it, sometimes. He still can't flew without getting really ill. It's not worth it, he says. But your dad's a wizard though, isn't he? Tunks nodded, kicking a small pebble out of her path. Molborn. Came to it late. Didn't get his letter till he was 15. I mean, imagine that, finding out that you're able to do something as fantastic as magic so late. He attended Hogwarts too, you know. He left Mole School at that age, and then got his letter. Went, too. Joined the 5th years and was given remedial lessons. Did his OWLs in his new years, but didn't get very far. Does that happen often? Asked Cecilia as the back of the Ambleside salutation hoved into view. Wizards getting letters so late in life? Tunks shook her magenta head. Dad's the only one I know of. I think he wouldn't have so many mole tendencies if he'd got his letter early. Sorry, sec, she added when Cecilia stopped abruptly. Sorry? Repeated Cecilia blankly, staring into a concerned face. No, I was just thinking. No. She shook her head, resisting the strong urge to pry further. Why are you sorry? Just. Well, I implied that mole tendencies were inferior. It was Tunks's turn to look confused when Cecilia began to laugh. Tracy Tunks, I would never have assumed you'd meant that. Cecilia grinned as Tunks did the same. Especially now you're getting friendly with Nick. How's he doing? Really well, replied Tunks, looking right at the zebra crossing and hoping that the blush on her cheeks had subsided by the time she had to check the traffic to the left. He's getting a lot of work done at the. Where is it? Unclear plant? Nuclear plant, corrected Cecilia, chuckling. Although a great deal of it is indeed unclear. I think. He's one of your oldest friends, Cecilia, declared Tunks, pausing to put an arm in front of Cecilia as Mrs. Frobisher almost made the last road crossing of her life. A Ford Mondeo blared out its horn as Cecilia jumped in fright. Thanks. She turned to Tunks and hugged her. In surprise, the younger woman hugged her back. Later, Cecilia would realize why Nymphadora Tunks had hung on momentarily longer than she needed. How's the work going? Asked Tunks, once they had safely crossed the road. They were now heading down the high street of the town, every other shop dedicated to mountaineering, climbing, Kendall mint cake or selling souvenirs. Cecilia paused in her retrieval of her shopping list and, noting the first shop she needed, for her vital gas canisters. I'm doing what I can, but I can't say it's easy. She looked at Tunks, whose hair seemed to be flickering between an unusual gold shade and magenta, giving the effect of her whole head being aglow. She looked from the younger woman's hair to her face. All that I'm doing by hand. Severus is in charge of the rest. Not that he'd let her just get on with it, she thought uncharitably. And he's letting you? Asked Tunks. Immediately her expression told Cecilia that she'd said something she shouldn't have. All I mean is, he's not putting pressure on you? He understands that I need to be with Remus, Cecilia said firmly. Tunks snorted. If you say so. You're saying he doesn't? He must, conceded Tunks softly. I don't know, I just get the feeling he wants you back at Hogwarts. Cecilia looked at her quickly before surrendering her cover and she nodded in agreement. He told me you'd asked him to contact Nick. I told him I wasn't the only person who knew science, Cecilia clarified, as she recalled the previous day's row. I didn't realize he actually would. I told him if he wanted to know about science he could ask anyone, for example, Nick. She stopped, and exhaled. Look, I don't want to go back to Hogwarts, or anywhere with Severus Snape. My life is with Remus now, she continued, and, as she did so, Tunks's expression changed, ever so slightly, as if a mental barrier had been removed. I'm just... You needn't be. Me too, said Cecilia. We're both defensive about the people we care about in our lives. We've got to learn to trust each other with them. Exactly, said Tunks, touching her on the arm. You need to go in here? Cecilia nodded. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to continue at all, she replied, pushing open the glass door. Now, what other news is there that I need to know about? Following her acquisition of gas canisters, a newspaper and AA batteries from the store-cum-junk shop that Cecilia had bought her radio from 2 months ago, she was more the wiser regarding a couple of her ex-students. By the time they had stepped onto the main street of Ambleside she knew that her mother, sister and goddaughter were safe and well, and as they passed the rough-cast buildings that housed mountaineering equipment, postcards and other tourist ephemera, Mrs. Cecilia Frobisher was fully aware that the order meeting yesterday had been a huge success. It was just a pity that, since she had given in her resignation, she couldn't ask of Tunks the specifics. Just as well, Cecilia told herself, otherwise that'd be one more step towards temptation. A small branch of HMV was Cecilia's next port of call, and she spent a good 10 minutes perusing the small stock of cassette albums that she could buy to play in her technologically ancient radio. It had fascinated Tunks, who, though had little interest in music, was attracted to the shape and form of the tapes and compact discs. Prizing the which from the latest hits stand where her investigation was drawing interest from the shop's manager, they went next door to a chemist where both women perused the perfumes, body sprays, deodorants, moisturizers and other goods of a girly nature for what seemed like 5 minutes but was in fact almost an hour. I've never been shopping in a mall town before, Tunks confided in Cecilia as she took a small selection of items, strictly those on her shopping list, to the woman on the till. I love it here, she continued as the woman bagged her purchases. It's like Diagon-E, only. Tunks broke off as they left the chemist and walked back onto the street. What is it? Asked Cecilia as the young woman seemed to sag at the shoulder. I've never tried fish and chips. Cecilia took Tunks the long way round to the place to be, passing the house over the stream. She explained it had been built like that in order to avoid the land tax, and Tunks had laughed, commenting on the ingenuity. They sat on a bench near the shore of Windermere, each holding a bag of warm lunch and a wooden fork, eating them as the glorious day's sunlight reflected off the lake's sheer surface. Why didn't you ask me about talking to Nick? Why did you ask Snape to do it? Tunks's question came out of the blue and Cecilia looked at her sharply. I would have ... Snape. Cecilia swallowed as she looked into Tunks's somber face. We had an argument, which isn't unusual for us, but I had to make it clear to him that I wasn't coming back, but we'd need access to science, one way or another. He needed to know about genetics, that's Nick's field. Our paths have diverged, there's more to it than just this. We need to get it right and fast. Realizing that she was becoming defensive, Cecilia broke off and waited for Tunks to respond. Eventually the witch nodded slowly. In a few moments' time Cecilia would be able to guess the reason for her apparent mistrust, the same mistrust that the witch had expressed when Lupin had given her mysterious mythology. You know that Remus is going to need your commitment now things are looking to get tough, Tunks continued, reiterating Cecilia's point. The mole who was sitting next to her nodded docilely, ignoring the potential interpretation of the witch's comment as being patronizing. and then both women, continuing to sit next to one another with the gleaming body of water before them, felt the metaphorical barrier evaporate, and a friendship was, if not soundly restored, in the process of repair. Their conversation began a few minutes later and stopped at various indicator points on the circuit of discussion, Sirius Black being one of them. They laughed at Tunks's cousin's masculine naivety, his idiocy at Christmas, and Cecilia's own that Sirius could have been more than a friend and that she could have been so taken in, though she was careful not to discuss the events directly prior to the Mistborn incident. She told Tunks that it was necessary for him to be in her life now for Remus's sake, that she was happy that he could give her intended the support he needed, and Tunks commented that it was strange how they'd both found happiness in each other's worlds. Cecilia felt her heart gladden. There the opportunity lay, she knew, where they could support one another. Then the conversation turned to weddings and marriage, and Cecilia asked Tunks how it was wizards married. She gave the same answer that Remus had done, all those months ago when she had first mentioned it, and she felt herself reaching for her neck where her locket hung, made from their hair entwined and transformed. I just don't know what the situation is, Cecilia continued as she took the empty wrapping paper from Tunks and combined it with her own as the younger woman leaned forward to listen. I think that he's very uneasy about what's going on at the ministry. That's why he's not arranged anything," murmured Tunks as Cecilia got to her feet and binned the rubbish. A few moments later and they had returned to the junk shop where Cecilia rummaged through the metal scraps in search of a halfway decent piece of zinc that she needed for the next stage of number 30, as well as a used solution of photographic developer, the residue of which, the chemist in her knew, would contain sufficient quantities of silver nitrate. Their journey back towards the waterfall was relatively uneventful, with the exception of the sensation of queasiness rising in Cecilia's stomach. Putting it out of her mind, she listened as Tunks spoke about the reforming of the Order and their meeting a few nights ago as they walked amongst tourists again who were also in search of the waterfall, though presumably not for the same reason as they were. There were plenty of cheers when Dumbledore read out your letter, Tunks continued, swinging the canvas bag containing Cecilia's gas cylinders onto her shoulder, almost dropping them out of the top. Deftly catching them in their transit between the bag and ground, Cecilia put them back in and pulled the straps onto the young woman's shoulder. At last they're rid of me, concluded Cecilia, smiling as Tunks frowned. No. That's not what they dash. Do you mean to say that no one said anything about my leaving being a betrayal to the Order? Tunks looked at her, blankly. Not in my hearing dash. Not even Snape? Tunks shook her head. At Cecilia's expression of disbelief she continued. No, he didn't, she repeated, shaking her head. He actually said that it was best for you, and the potion. Did he really? Cecilia said the words softly, more in commentary to her own memory than in reply. But Tunks nodded in agreement. He also said that because of the work we're doing, Kingsley is concerned about the situation in the ministry. The look of horror on Tunks's face as she broke off was enough to tell Cecilia that the witch had given away something. She stopped and Tunks stopped too, looking at her open-mouthed. And you mean, of course, the situation with Remus, murmured Cecilia generously as Tunks nodded in relief. Look, I've resigned. I'm not involved with the Order. It was a mistake to join it in the first place and have a say, and quite a relief to leave it all behind me. I don't need to know the details and there's no way that I'll be tempted by curiosity. She smiled at Tunks, who looked as if she was about to burst into tears. It's time I took a leaf out of your book, she added. To her surprise the young witch was hugging her, holding her arms with her hands and pulling her closer. A swell of relief passed through Cecilia as she realized how big a relief it was to admit it. But she and Nick had got married. I know you weren't horrible. It seemed horrible at the time, but deep down I knew. Cecilia took a step back and this time, she looked confused as Tunks's conversation became panicky and disjointed. her face beginning to redden and her hair a muddy white as if every color of her hair was showing itself simultaneously. "There's been a change in the law. It's meant that he would have to be befuddled, and unless we were married, he would forget me. I love him. Cecilia. Mum nearly killed me because of the rush. It's for keeps," she finished as Cecilia reached out her arm as Tunks implored her not to tell anyone. "Can we keep this just between us? For now?" Cecilia nodded as she curled her arm into that of her friend. "Well, actually," conceded Tunks as they walked on, "could you tell Remus? I want him to know, and it would be best coming from you." Cecilia felt herself nodding again and this time took her hand. They began to walk again up the hill to the waterfall, and for a moment they looked like two school children, best of friends. I'll always love him," Tunks continued wistfully as they neared the top of the waterfall. "I don't think I couldn't, but it's not love in a romantic sense. He's been part of my life for such a long time, and she paused, looking at the freshwater stream below the bridge before back to Cecilia. "I love Nick. I've made my choice and I'm going to spend the rest of my life with him. And we're going to be happy." That was the part of the conversation that remained with Cecilia as they made their way at speed towards the safe point from which Tunks could flew. She was late, she explained to Cecilia, and if she didn't get her back soon she wouldn't have time to get back to St. Bees before she had to be at the ministry. 10 minutes later they had got to the spot where they had flew in, and Tunks apologized to Cecilia for not being able to stop for some tea as she discreetly pulled out her wand. Cecilia stepped towards the greenish glow and said that was quite all right, and she and her husband would have to come back to the cottage for some Remus-cooked dinner. And then, as the familiar flu-induced lurch of her stomach bolted through her, Cecilia felt that the past had been put behind them, replacing it with a happy, if unexpected future. 88,888,888. Closing the door to his father's study, on the second floor of number 12, Grimald Place, Sirius hurried across the carpets that festooned the floorboards and knelt in front of the hearth. Holding a handful of flute dust, he threw his hand forward. Opening his palm, he looked at it as the dim firelight reflected off its facets, and second thoughts fought off his first thoughts. His first thoughts had compelled him to hastily extract himself from the conversation that was continuing below, with order members continually replacing one another as they were wont to do in times of urgency when they were required to share information quickly, to race upstairs and hide himself away to pursue his hobby. His first thoughts had brought him to his knees before the fireplace that was the main focal point of the study after grabbing a handful of green sand-like powder from the basket on the left. His first thoughts had raced ahead, speculating on the likely scene in which his quarry would be playing. Those were his first thoughts, which had stood firm for a good year and had not yet failed him. Sirius had begun to duck in and out of random fireplaces when he was a young wizard, with interesting results and more than a few near misses, and it was a habit which he had resumed, though tentatively at first, when he had returned to his family home. When he was bored. When he was feeling low. For some chance entertainment. One quick handful and he could summon scenes of other people. Of their lives. It did no harm. But then there was Cecilia Frobisher. The first time he had spied on her using the Flu Network had been after his first drunken attempt on her life when she had returned to Hogwarts. He had been fascinated with her. From her restless pacing, dressed in worn all-day clothing and her hair tangled and knotted as she wrestled with a mental puzzle. Her waking and thanking an absent house elf for clean towels and a filled bath and a tantalizing appearance minutes later. Her tears of frustration when she had known she was right in the face of an immovable Snape. Her glorious form in her Imanus dress. She was only Imal. But she fascinated him nonetheless. No. His second thoughts were holding out an impressive defensive block as his first thoughts had prompted him to almost drop the flu powder and continue with his espionage, preventing his first thoughts from urging Sirius past the point of no return. No. It was wrong, plain and simple. He knew he shouldn't be doing it. The woman had been a paradigm of integrity with regard to Harry's potion against profound provocation. She needed to be protected. One little look wouldn't hurt. No. Closing his hand around the Floo powder, Sirius leaned back on his knees. He could hardly fool himself that he was looking out for her well-being by covert means. That type of thinking would drive him crazy. Leaning forward again, Sirius opened his hand, uttering his destination, and a few moments later the stone of the fireplace transformed into that of a study, one which he recognized. He and James had visited it many, many times, and he took in the chairs and table legs. Almost as soon as his eyes got used to the scene, the door opened and the McGonagalls' feet and robe hem swept into view. Whispering hastily, the scene changed to that of the Gryffindor common room, sunlight beaming through the 3 knights' stained glass and illuminating the absence of students. Of course Harry wouldn't be the. He would be in lessons or studying, or, if he was anything like his father, avoiding work and bunking off with Ron. Sighing, Sirius reached for some more Floo powder and uttered the words and the secret password which Dumbledore had himself set to access this part of the network that would bring him into the fireplace in the living room of Lupin's cottage, and he wondered what task or activity Mrs. Frobisher would be undertaking in her mull, non-magical manner. And now she sat, he could see, in the kitchen at the table poring over books and parchments lost in abstract thoughts, no doubt. Sirius felt the Floo flames flicker around him as he watched her rest her face on her hand as she glanced between page and what it was she was writing. Like so many times before, Sirius mused grimly, so many times when she was there alone, or working, clearly working, where he wanted to stop her, talk to her. Find out what she was thinking, or why she decided to do what she did at a particular moment. He knew how to annoy her, and get her defensive, but she could not be held down for long. He could equal her by challenging her at every step. It took a good deal of effort to match her. But if she wasn't the enemy anymore, why did he still feel the need to win? Why did she bother him so? He shook the thought from his mind as if it were a recalcitrant insect, as he watched her cross the kitchen through the living room kitchen doorway and then cross back. Something was on her mind. He had seen her pace back and forth like that in her room and in Hogwarts Mull Studies classroom several times before. Sirius knew she was wrestling with something vital to her. Whether to her work or whether to something else in her life. No witch would behave the way she did, and no mole he had ever met either. What if she were a witch? Forcing out the thought, Sirius watched Cecilia recross the kitchen and sit back down, fumbling through a large, wide-spinned book before looking at her notes again. Why could his mind not let of her? Why had he told her his silly, stupid ideas? With any luck she would have forgotten all about it in her quest of perfection for the potion that his godson was to take. But then again, how likely was that with her? Sirius watched Cecilia pull her hands through her hair in frustration as she scribbled through something on the sheet of paper next to her. She remembered everything, including, more annoyingly, things that he said and did, especially his mistakes. Still, he shouldn't be doing this. But what harm was there in watching her, making sure she was safe for Moony? You can't keep a good dog down. A knock at the door caused Sirius to jump, and he pulled his face from the grate. It was Arthur Weasley, who smiled as Sirius hauled himself to his feet, attempting to look impassive as the wizard approached him. "Sturgis has just left," he began, handing Sirius a sheaf of parchments, "and then Benjamin left us with some new Azkaban reports before shooting off too. I thought you'd like to see them before Minerva hid them." Sirius nodded, glancing into the fireplace. Mr. Weasley watched him turn his head, noting the trail of Floo powder on the Wilton carpet before taking a step towards him. "If you don't mind me saying so, Sirius, you seem to be stuck up here an awful lot." Arthur touched Sirius on the shoulder and the wizard turned. "I can understand how frustrating it must be that Harry is at Hogwarts, especially with his involvement. There's not much else I can be doing. I was declared free, but the Ministry still want me for questioning, and I know their brand of questioning. Mr. Weasley watched Sirius visibly sag at the shoulders and he pitied him. "Well," said Arthur, patting him again on the shoulder, "here's a task, then. We rescue the reports, all of them. They need filing and shelving, and relevant information collecting." Sirius felt the weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he relieved Arthur Weasley of the papers. "Excellent, that'll keep me busy." He smiled briefly at Arthur, who waved his wand and shelved Sirius's burden onto the empty dusty shelves behind him that had previously housed his family's books before making his way to the door, and Sirius nodded to the wizard as he read the title of the First Order report as he put the thought of what was denied him at the back of his mind. "Oh, by the way," added Arthur Weasley as Sirius began the gargantuan task of sorting the reports, "our letter arrived downstairs in the hallway half. Was yours occupied?" Sirius jerked his head towards the study's door as Arthur made his way back over to Sirius, letter in hand. "I must have left it switched on," said Sirius vaguely as he took it, all hope of returning to observing Cecilia Frobisher evaporating around him. "Thanks, Arthur." "You're welcome. By the way, Molly says it's nearly time for tea." 88,888,888. In a cold, dank cellar below a Georgian terraced house a few hundred miles from the most unsecret of secret orders, a mere flicker of life revealed its grotesque form in the darkness. Even though it was bright sunshine outside, down here even the solar energy feared to enter. The voice emanating from its body reeked of agent frailty, but the words evoked dormant power. The figure that had the fortune, or possibly the misfortune, to stand before the contemptible body stood silently. That had been the mode of their arrival, but the monstrosity that had once been the most powerful wizard in the world knew that the figure was there. "Of my enemies, what have you to report?" Voldemort's voice rasped out the words that were quickly absorbed by the dense atmosphere. "My lord," replied the figure lightly, "I was under the impression that the movements of those particular people were of little consequence to you." Their words provoked sharp intake of breath to the figure's right, and, at once, the obvious dawned. Wormtail. Of course he would be there, at his lord's beck and call. "Anti-mole laws have been tightened, my lord," continued the figure, divulging the required information. "The Ministry believe, as you intended, that moles are deemed to be a security risk and as such are barred from wizard premises." The figure remained stock still as the voice glided slowly to their left. Good. They are closing in on themselves. By the time the incompetent law enforcers have sorted it out, I will have regained my strength. You are to be congratulated." The rasping was growing stronger with the satisfaction that Voldemort's voice betrayed, and the figure breathed lightly. "And the mole? The one which we have engaged to carry out our bidding? He has been sufficiently motivated by money, I trust?" The figure's mental field scrolled back to the man's face in the car at Brighton. The deed was foul, no question. Yet the search for the ideal mole for the job could not have been simpler. "Indeed, my lord. He would be more than willing to do away with his entire family, I am certain, were there enough used mole banknotes in exchange for it." "Good. But my lord," countered the figure, turning swiftly in the direction of the rasping, which the figure was almost sure had turned to a soft hissing voice, "surely moles are our enemies. Many of your followers are indeed shocked at your move." There was a silence. Nothing, except for a rustle behind the figure that, if they had been asked to swear to, they would have described as a slither. "This mole whom you have engaged, he is nothing to us but a mercenary. He is a mere stepping stone upon whose deeds I will thrive. Not only will I regain my full strength and defeat Harry Potter, but I will gain full understanding of the universal link before destroying the mole Cecilia Frobisher." "And how will you do that, my lord?" Another moment of silence filled the dankness, and the figure had to use all of their strength not to recoil at the sudden stench. "My enemy's enemy is my friend." 88,888,888. Reports, More reports. Sirius had catalogued by date more than a score of them in the last 2 hours. Evening was on the rise. The dimming light shimmered off the rim of the dish in which Molly Weasley had brought up her hearty bowl of summer vegetable soup when he had not gone down himself to partake in any, and she had tutted at her husband's thoughtlessness in bringing the reports to him, congratulating Sirius in equal measure in taking up the burden. But now, even her soothing words had bolstered his ego so much, and now, as the evening drew in, his urge to revisit the fireplace of his friend's cottage had become now irresistible. Leaving the other half of reports on the table near the window, Sirius made his way back over to the fireplace, watching the cinders glowing in temptation. And then, before he knew it, his hand reached towards the Floo powder pot and he was kneeling in the hearth. He was about to stick his head into the hearth when a voice, crackly and weak, made him stop. "Yes, Great-grandfather Phineas?" Sirius got back to his feet and made his way, Floo powder still in his fist, over to the portrait of his ancestor. Phineas Nigellus looked down at his descendant as he addressed him, using the same sing-song voice that he remembered his great-grandson using when he was a child. "I said I wouldn't do that if I were you." "And why not?" Between Sirius's fingers the green sand-like powder began to fall, and he opened his other palm and tipped some of the escaping grains into it. "Remus Lupin is my friend, my only friend now." "You take a deal of interest in that mole, far more, I believe, than you can excuse on your friend's behalf. What is your real reason?" He stopped in his pigmented movement as Sirius allowed the Floo powder to fall through his fingers and onto his prize Persian carpet. "I already lost a friend to a redhead 20 years ago, I'm just being cautious for him." Sirius turned quickly and made his way across to the table on which the order reports lay and picked up the letter that had arrived for him that afternoon. "She is interesting," conceded Sirius, unfolding the letter. "Besides, she has sought my help, and who would I be to refuse? To aid a mole? Indeed." Phineas Nigellus sniffed. A great feat for a long painted portrait, and a flake or two of pigment floated off down towards the floor. "I believe you assisted her, did you not?" Sirius goaded, reading through the list of questions with which Cecilia Frobisher had asked for his help. "And I aided you in her downfall, something you never quite managed to pull off," replied Phineas stiffly. "If I were still alive I would be dead before a mole entered my house." But Sirius was not listening to his antecedent. Instead, he was reading through the letter again, before reading out the list of questions to Phineas. "All these sound balmy to me," commented Sirius to Phineas. "She seems to think that wizards have access to different amounts of magic." He shook his head as he looked back at the portrait of Nigellus, watching the pursed lips of his great-grandfather break into a smirk. "Of course there is, stupid boy." Evening sunlight bounced off the whites of Phineas's eyes as his know-it-all great-grandson stared back at him in confusion. "Of course there are different levels. It all depends on the blood, like I've always told you." "The blood?" Sirius rolled his eyes at his family's stock answer for everything, but this time Phineas Nigellus didn't bite back. Instead, the portrait waited for Sirius to either ask him or remain silent enough for him to explain. "Of course in the blood. Does anything the mole seek have even the remotest connection to pure-blood wizards? Of course not. Does she speak of a change in magical ability on behalf of people whose parents are purer blood? No. This is what you should report back to her, my lad, that none of these questions are relevant to pure-blood wizards. Cura in potentia." He was about to continue when he realized Sirius wasn't listening anymore. Instead, he was walking away from his portrait and was making his way back over to the studies table. "We need her." He walked back to Phineas and looked up at him before gesturing towards the fireplace. "Lupin believes she loves him and she's holding at his cottage. But for all we know she could disappear back to her own world and dash. And you wouldn't be able to control her anymore, finished Phineas stiffly. Here we are again, the young thinking they know better than the elderly. You are on a path to destruction if you tried to control muls, young Sirius. Cooperation, that seems to be the key. Sirius stopped. For a moment he thought he had heard the magical portrait of his great-grandfather tell him that persecuting muls wasn't the way forward and that Quua in Potentia had reverted back to its original meaning. How goes the revolution, great-grandson? Do you mean yours or mine? Same thing, said Phineas evenly. Very poor, from what I am given to understand. Sirius exhaled. Voldemort has gone into hiding, he's badly injured and we are trying to locate him in order to defeat him. I see. Well, from the Blacks long past, good luck with that one. His portrait faded. Sirius waited a moment in case Phineas came back before turning and looking at the fireplace again. Then, before he knew it, he was standing in front of the fireplace again. So checking in his friend's soon-to-be wife for her own safety was trying to control her, was it? Reaching for the flue pot again, he cast some of the greenish dust into it, watching it flare, and knelt before it. 88,888,888. It was an oversight, a large oversight on my part for which everyone will eventually pay the price. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore pushed up his half-moon spectacles as he rose from his seat in his own office and addressed his own ex-double agent. The wizard in question, though free from the will of Lord Voldemort, had now crippled their cause somewhat. That was not the oversight, however, and Dumbledore was quick to point this out to Snape. How likely is it that he will attempt to harness Mul power for his own Severus, as you described to me? He made his way across to the potions master, whose usually granite-like appearance had flickered momentarily in his presumption. It returned in a heartbeat, and he shifted infinitesimally taller in his stature as he looked back at Dumbledore silently. He has spoken of it, headmaster, he conceded eventually, though more during his darkest times. His call has been more frequent of late, and I believe he has spurred many of his followers into action, though none have yet been detected. Dumbledore began to pace towards the pictures of his predecessors, occasionally looking up at their faces in turn, before looking back at Snape. As to whether he would actually employ a Mul in the same way that you did, I hardly think that's likely. However improbable, it is not impossible. That is what I am most worried about. Dumbledore continued to pace across his office, glancing across to Snape. He stopped. I believe that very soon our ability to converse securely within the walls of this school will be greatly restricted. This night Tabitha Penright is seeing off Dolores Umbridge, but she will return, as will many requirements from the Ministry. I overlooked this possibility the last time, and now, with no trace of his whereabouts, I must admit, I have to consider the improbable. He saw Snape sag at the shoulders and his left arm flinch involuntarily. The wizard had offered on more than half a dozen occasions to attempt to restore the cruel and tortuous connection between himself and Voldemort. On each occasion Dumbledore refused his offer, claiming the miraculous cure could be used as an incentive to any Death Eater who wished to free themselves from the Dark Lord's grip. We are running out of time. There is no need to suppose that Voldemort knows how to restore his soul fully when the time is right, but we must suppose it. There is no need to suppose that he knows how to achieve this, but again, we must suppose such a situation. My premise is this. He is planning to cause havoc with his terrorism in the Mul world, Severus, because he can. He needs the links to the wizard world where he can get it, and there were still enough Death Eaters. He is hidden and obscured from view. Dumbledore trailed off as he concluded his circuit back round to his desk and sat on the chair behind it and sank into it. Beside him, Fawkes squawked noisily. And Mrs. Frobisher? Cecilia is still safe where she is? She is immovable in herself, that is for certain. The trail I have thrown the Ministry of the misleading befuddled memories will not lead her to harm. She is quite safe as long as she remains in Lupin's cottage and under no circumstances communicates with anyone. By happy chance Lupin's own mode of magical transport being strictly limited has made for an entirely safe environment for Mrs. Frobisher, as the Ministry do not check Shacklebolt. Your belief that previous correspondence allowed the Ministry to gain a rough location for her was, indeed, true. However, whence this correspondence came I suppose we'll never know. We must assume then that the Dark Lord may indeed have access to anything. As we have no direct link to his whereabouts or any hint of his plans,